You can go ahead.
Yes, sir. Just a second. Okay, let's begin. Who joined in today for the session are honorable teachers, principal sir, society mates, and students. I, Shirish Zuria, head of the publications department at the Finance and Investment Cell, Atmanav Sanathan College, take immense pride to announce that our college has another feather in its caps, thanks to India Today ranking it as the 10th best college nationwide, out of over 1,600 reviewed, and couldn't have been possible without the august guidance of our principal and dynamic leader, Professor Gyantosh Jha. The University of Delhi is celebrating its centenary anniversary, and thus, in order to commemorate its grand achievement, we here at FIC present to you all #Econ Dialogues, a series of 4 engaging sessions featuring venerable professors and speakers commentating on the state of the Indian economy post-COVID. Our society stands for and is deeply devoted towards the principles of progressive analysis and establishing foundations in finance in its student polity, determined towards facilitating budding investors and economists, which despite limitations due to the pandemic, has quickly pivoted towards digital media. Now let me introduce you all to today's speaker. Dr. Anjali Tondon is assistant professor at the Institute of Studies in Industrial Development. She has done PhD in economics from Jamia Millia Islamia, and her thesis is on the structural changes in energy use in the Indian economy using input-output models with special reference to India's international trade. As part of her MPhil dissertation, she specialized on India-China merchandise trade. Prior to joining ISID, she has worked with the National Council of Applied Economic Research, NCAER. She has been a recipient of the ICCSR Doctoral Fellowship and is a visiting researcher at the University of Melbourne in August 2010. She is a contributor to the Global Trade Analysis Package version 8 database of Purdue University, USA. Dr. Anjali has a work experience of over 20 years in different areas, with her research interests including trade, FDI, industry, domestic agriculture policy, and energy. She has authored academic papers in referred international and national journals, and also writes frequently in Economic Times, Financial Express, and EPW. Now, for the session today, I shall now ask Dr. Balakrishnan Negi to continue with the proceedings. Doctor, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Shirish. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, a warm good morning to one and all but present here in our webinar series. This is the third day of our webinar series organized by Finance and Investment Cell, Department of Economics, Atmaram Sanatan Dharma College, under the aegis of the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, ARSD College. First of all, I extend my gratitude and thanks to our visionary and dynamic principal sir, who always support us to conduct such kind of academic activity. Because of his encouragement and his vision to achieve the excellence in academics, that we are able to do such kind of the academic activities. Thank you, sir. I also extend my thanks to IQAC convener, Dr. Vinita Tuli ma'am, and her team to providing us the technical support during all the session, especially thanks to Ravinderji for his constant support, technical support to do such kind of academic activities. Now we have with us the visionary principal sir, Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jha. I would like to invite our principal sir to say a few words of encouragement. Principal sir.
I think Dr. Negi, he has got some kind of important meeting, so he could not join. Really sorry, things are happening too fast. Okay, so I think we should move ahead with the session. Yeah.
We have changes in some programs. That is by inconvenience. Sorry for the inconvenience.
Yeah.
So this is what is third day of our the webinar series, in which the Econ Dialogue, which is organized by the Finance and Investment Cell, ARSD College. We have we are trying to covering all the the sectors which has been affected, dramatically affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, not only in India, but across the country. We all know that since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, that the economic growth, not only in India, across the world has been declined dramatically. The negative growth which we have experienced in first 1 year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and slowly that pandemic doesn't matter. It is affecting economy across the world. What is important, what matters important is how quickly you are getting out of that the slump which has caused by the pandemic. And this depends on what kind of policy, appropriate policy, short run as well as longer, not only focusing towards the short run, the slumps which we have experienced from the COVID-19, but the visionary, the planning, policy should be envisaged what we actually wanted to have, the shape of economy after the kind of, the uncertainty or the elements which we have, pandemics, wars, and all that. So we have short-run policies as well as the long-run policies. If we see in case of India, every country is facing the problem, and this depends on the policy, what kind of policy has been adopted by the respective government to get out of this, problem. So we need to see what kind of the policies has been adopted and how it has how the growth has responded through this policy. So if you see in case of India, we have we have experienced a slump during the first year of pandemic. Quickly we get out from that pandemic in terms of overall growth, which we have seen in the first and second quarter of 2021 financial year, that Indian economy experienced a kind of V-shaped growth rate. Similarly, if we talk, today's talk is generally, we are focused towards the ramification of COVID-19 on, trade and investments. If you see, because of the government, appropriate policies, just like, the remission of duties and taxes on export products, and, the providing a good corpus to the Exim Bank and production linked incentive recently, which has been announced by the government. Because of all these foresighted policies, that Indian external sector has recovered very the momentum in first quarter of the 2021, and we have experienced a kind of surplus in overall balance of payment. However, we are facing currently that the kind of the international liquidity tightening, which is because of the surging prices of commodities at international level, and then the disruption of supply chain due to the war between the Russia and Ukraine is posing a kind of challenges for the India for 2022-23. So this is the kind of challenges. Again, the policy which matters. These are the short terms, as I told you, that the pandemic, wars is not in our control. This is generally disrupting the supply chain all over the country. So what matters is the policy. So if you see in case of Indian policy related to trade, production, and attracting more investment, not during the COVID-19, before the COVID-19, this government is continuously focusing towards the infrastructure and easing the business, making a kind of environment where we can attract more investment by strengthening the ease of doing business, and by we are moving towards the industrial policy 4.0. So, and if you see in case of many flagship programs, which is generally focusing towards the infrastructure development, and that infrastructure development, we must focus much more on this infrastructure development, which is more important for production as well as trade and investment. So this government is, is rightly taking policy initiative towards, the infrastructure, towards the business environment. to attract more investment, more infrastructure development, and for more production, and finally for the trade. So to know some issues and challenges which is there, I think we must be understand that India being a labor abundant country, India is not doing much better in case of the labor intensive. And many more argued recently that India's next driver of growth in terms of foreign trade must be focused on the labor intensive industry, like textile industry, where the China is losing their share at the international level. India can take up the next driver of growth in case of this intensive industry, but unfortunately it is not happening. So the Vietnam and Bangladesh is doing much better as compared to India. This is what is we can change a challenge, and we can have the perspective for future growth in trade and investment. And secondly, the challenges that we can say, the second is that India is moving towards the industrial revolution 4.0, keeping in mind existing problem at the structure or composition of labor market, where we have 80% of laborers are either semi-skilled or unskilled. So India is really ready to move towards the industrial revolution 4.0. 4.0. These are some challenges where the government need to focus, and government is trying to do upskilling the labor force and all that, but how it is working at the ground level. So to understand all these issues, challenges, and the future perspective of the production, trade, and investment, today we have with us is eminent scholar and researcher, Dr. Anjali Tondon. My heartfelt thanks to Dr. Anjali Tondon to agreeing to be the speaker of the today's session. Although we have some changes, maybe she may be changes in the program. So again, I my heartfelt thanks to agreeing to be the speaker of today's session. So before we start, let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Anjali Tondon is an associate professor of Institute of Studies in Industrial Development, ISID, one of the eminent research institutions in India. She has done PhD in economics from Jamia Millia Islamia. Her doctoral thesis is on structural changes and energy use in Indian economy using input-output model with special references to India's international trade. Prior to her joining ISID, she has worked with the National Council of Applied Economic Research, again, one of the leading think tanks in India in economics, and IIMC. She was a visiting researcher at the University of Melbourne. In August 2010, she is contributor to Global Trade Analysis Package, GTAP, version 8 database of Tood University. Her research interest includes trade, FDI, industry, domestic agriculture, policy, and energy. She has, apart from that, facilitating the introduction, she has also published many, the research article in national and international journals. Once again, I thanks to Dr. Anjali Tondon for being with us to deliver today's lecture. So I would like to invite Dr. Anjali Tondon to deliver our lecture. Thank you, ma'am, once again. And Mike is over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negi. Good morning, everybody. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the principal of the Atmaram Sanatan College, Professor Gyanatosh Jha, members of the FIC committee, and Dr. Apra Sena for initiating this series of 4 sessions, and also considering me as a resource person to be part of the same. I understand that the participants in the program today are mostly scholars, and therefore I've tried to keep my session relatively less technical to be able to provide more discussion points which the participants, the scholars, will probably find benefit for them to be following in some form or the other, say for instance in writing their term papers or taking up some specific research in future. So with that, I would start my presentation, and as I share my screen, yes, can my screen be seen? Can somebody confirm me?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, thank you,
Visible,
Dr.
ma'am.
Apra. And thank you, Shirish. And this is also to make a prior announcement that my session was scheduled the day after, and I was midway in making my presentation. So some things which may not be in perfect order, please bear with them. So the title of my talk today is A Run-Up to the Post-Pandemic India, a prognosis and the way forward. So what do we mean by run-up? A run-up is when it refers to a point from where we begin our race. So all of you would agree that how we are positioned when the race begins is very important. If we are positioned slightly backwards, then we will have to struggle more in many more different ways. And if we are positioned slightly forward, then we would have some advantages. So this I'm talking in terms of an position of an athlete. But if you transform the same anomaly to our economic conditions, then you would like to think that if we are backward in some areas or lagging, I should use the word lagging rather, where we are yet to settle our own house right, then it means, and there's a sudden pandemic that breaks on us, on the entire world, then we have to pick up in many more areas than what a developed country would be doing. So we have to gear up ourselves in many more spheres. So that is why it is very important to understand this pandemic broke on us, because our trajectory of recovery and growth in future is strongly tied up to our structure, the structure that we are carrying forward with us. Okay, so that is why I've titled this presentation as the run-up to the post-pandemic. So I have structured this presentation. To begin with, I will discuss a bit of economics, which I'll keep absolutely non-technical. I'll connect that to the COVID pandemic, and then I'll bring you to a point, essentially the run-up point where we had our position, economic position, and then we will try and link it up to where do we go forward in the post-pandemic view. Okay, so let's start. So very often, I just need a moment to settle my bar. Yes, I'm better now. So what is the backdrop of this talk today? Now, very often the policy making in terms of growth and development focuses on some specific industries, because we think that in order to so often the growth and development status of a country is linked up to its per capita and national income levels. And when we compare ourselves to better developed countries, then we see that our per capita income or our national income should reach a certain level at which they are. Now, often the strategic focus on this development policy is that we try to jump up to catch up those industries where those developed countries are actually performing. But in the process, we forget that we are not adequately placed. We are not sufficiently able to reach that target. So there is a trajectory, and if we try and leapfrog to that, then it leads to some problems, some which which are actually due to some structural incoherences in the system. So a general tendency in the past 3 decades of policy making has been that there has been an enhanced focus on growth and development strategies and the importance to sustainability in terms of a sustained growth and in terms of environmental sustainability has got traction, has picked up. Now, the hardest task for a policymaker to be successful is to identify a suitable set of industries which would actually support this development agenda. And a most common approach here is that we look up to a developed country or a developed world and we see what is happening there. And we tend to believe that, oh, if they are moving in artificial intelligence, they are moving towards something robotic, then, and if we have to reach that per capita income, then we should also be, indulging aggressively into artificial intelligence or some areas where those developed countries are performing. Now, these technologies are generally capital intensive. So what in the process we tend to do is we shift our focus to capital intensive industries, which is not a bad thing to be doing. But if in the process we forget to concentrate on where we have our strengths, which is labor intensive industries for a country like India, then we tend to ignore a large part of our workforce, of our industrial structure, etc. So to understand this, let's talk about China for a moment. So prior to 1978, when China formally launched its reforms, the Chinese policy was aggressively targeting for expansion of their capital intensive industry manufacturing. And for that, what was done? So a lot of resources were relocated artificially through subsidies, through incentives, so that people who are engaged in agriculture and in labor intensive industries have a subsidized consumption, they were able to save, and therefore they were able to spend on a more capital intensive inputs. And these industries were subsidized in the production process by the policy making. But because the inherent structure of the economy was not adequate to sustain such an industrial development, the system was not sustainable. And very soon the policymakers realized this, and having realized in 1978, they changed their policy approach where they shifted their focus on development of their inherent competence, where their comparative advantage lied, which was in labor intensive industries. So as soon as the policy making shifted their focus to labor intensive industries, which is a point, which is a core of their comparative advantage, the system was more sustainable. And today we know how China has turned into a global leader in many other spheres, not only in labor intensive, but in some more capital intensive industries also. But their path, their trajectory occurred only by realizing their comparative advantage. So they figured it out very early and they transformed their process. And that's how today we know it's a leader, it's a world leader in many industries. So this was just to share how countries realize their mistakes, and they change their development policy focus also. So this I'm referring to this paper by Zhu, Li, and Wong in 2008, which essentially talks of new structural economics. And the authors have emphasized that for a country's development process, the policy needs to recognize, needs to endogenize its available resources as a key part of industrial choices. That means that industrial choices, the choice of industries which are selected to be supported in the policy making process should take into account that those industries which are selected are compatible with the availability of resources. By resources, we are talking of factors of production, which are essentially labor and capital. So the choice of industries that we pick should be able to capitalize our internal labor, our internal capital. So if we are more labor intensive, as India is, we should focus on, going by this theory, we should focus on labor intensive industries. We should also focus on capital intensive industries, but not at the cost of labor intensive industries. And the paper says that simply by adopting a catching up philosophy, a catching up process, that this is where the developed countries is, and if we want to reach that per capita level income, we should engage ourselves into that process, is not going to be successful. Because in the process, we will end up reallocating our resources, and it can be detrimental to a larger agenda of equitable growth progress, equitable growth, development, and income development. So another paper by Shi in 2010, and it's an IMF working paper, also emphasizes on similar things. And the author there notes that structural coherence supports stronger growth. Structural coherence means the structure of the industry or structure in the economy, which we often measure in terms of proportionate share of sectors in output, in employment, in trade, in foreign direct investment. So we can have these 4 or 5 macro indicators by which we measure structure of an economy. So structure of the economy should be coherent, should be in sync with its endowments. Endowments means the level of factors of production. So if an economy has a greater endowment of labor, its structure of output should be more labor intensive, should be skewed, should have a more significant proportionate presence of labor intensive industries and lesser of capital intensive industries. And similarly, its employment structure should be more skewed towards engagement in labor intensive activities. Its FDI should be more attractive, more be attracted to labor intensive industries, and similarly on other parameters. So Shi's paper notes that almost a 30% differential in growth rates is accounted for. So countries where the structural sinking is observed between the structure of the economy and the endowments tend to grow 30%. So 30% have a growth rate which is 30% higher than those of the economies where this structural sinking is not as strong. So that means structural coherence supports growth. And that is what the underlying agenda of policy making is. Growth should be more equitable, should be more sustainable. But however, what happens for a policymaker, these underlying announcements that we announce in any pandemic or even in a general course of development tend to bypass this critical aspect of growth, which is linking the growth structure, the structure of the economy to its underlying endowments. And therefore, a thinking is needed. And we'll try and emphasize on the same point again and again through this presentation. I have some, okay. Let me move to the next slide. Okay, so how does this link operate? So in an open economy, there are domestic endowments. So we have domestic employment and we have endogenously available capital. But if the economy is open, then our employment and our capital is not operating in isolation. There are external forces that tend to impact us. And how does that happen? That essentially happens when we dropped our barriers in 1991. A lot of capital inflows were eased out. and they were eased out in two different ways. First, imports of capital goods became cheaper. We had access at lower tariffs to superior technology, which is embodied in capital inputs. So we could access a lot of capital goods. We could access technology without an actual transfer of technology, right? So we had access, so we got capital imports, which tended to improve our capital intensity, our capital intake in the economy, whereas domestic capital investment was not occurring as much. So our endowments of capital began to change through liberalization. Another way of changing capital was that we eased out FDI. FDI was liberated, and so a lot of investment that came into capital intensive industries. So those industries took off, and as we deregulated and we delicensed those industries, which were prior to liberalization confined to public sector or select licensed private operators. So a lot of investment came there, and those domestic capital intensive industries took off. So in the process, but anything specific in labor intensive industries was not as starkly as it was for the capital intensive industries. So our endowments began to change, and we probably did not notice or did not take a very sharp notice of these things. In the meantime, gradually in 2000s, what also happened was the emergence of global value chains, where the production structure was fragmented across industries, different countries producing different parts, components of an item. And for instance, in iPhone, the core R&D and development is done in the US. The parts and components are manufactured in many countries, also in China. And from all these countries, these parts and components are then imported into China, where the item is assembled. And then China, the final product from iPhone is taken out from China. So when all these things happen, what does this tell? That an assembly, that whereas we see a capital intensive, a high technology product as an iPhone, as a mobile smartphone, coming out from a country like China, which had its comparative advantage only in labor intensive industries. So they capitalized their comparative advantage, and the global value chains, they integrated themselves so well into the chains that they could scale up in a labor intensive industry, and the entire value chain considers China now as an indispensable part of the production structure. So when this production chain gets fragmented, then what happens? So China has access to technology, R&D, which comes from US and different other parts of the world, say Germany, where some advanced components of a smartphone are manufactured, and China gets access to that because it is part of a fragmented production structure. So globalization has led to rapid division of labor-intensive activities, as I just discussed, and the fragmentation of the production changed the entire paradigm of international trade. So what happens now? International trade occurs. It occurs more in intermediate inputs and as compared to final goods. So whereas only one iPhone is traded from China, is exported from China, but prior to that, it imports so many intermediates, which it uses in its assembly line production system. So what you can make out from here is that the pattern of international trade has changed over time from trading of final goods to trading of intermediate goods. Okay, so now when there's a lot of trading of intermediate goods, the access to technology, which is embodied in those intermediate goods, as I told you, the core R&D of the iPhone, which is embodied, which is happening in US, is reaching China, right? So it is able to access to technology without being part of the R&D system. So even if the technology is not transferred to China, it has access to it through imported use. Okay, so this is how the import dependence of a country increases. And this is also how the import content of its export. So it is exporting an iPhone and it is heavily dependent on imports. So it has a big success in exports, but it is essentially on the strength of its imports. So import content of exports increases and import dependence has also increased. So I'll come to India, but I'm trying to give you the underlying philosophy of this talk by elaborating on global value chains. So therefore, trade in intermediate supports access to factors of production. And what are they? We are talking of capital and labor also. So it gives access to capital intensive technology also. And it also gives access to some labor intensive inputs because the products, because whichever country is competent in producing one part of the, say for instance, an automobile component, we are good in manufacturing auto components, parts. So it's a labor and if such an industry is labor intensive, then and if these parts are imported by another country, then even labor intensive inputs are also imported. So the underlying point is that through trade in intermediates, the access to factors of production, labor and capital becomes easier. And when it becomes easier, it tends to displace domestic capital and domestic labor. That means there is a displacement effect on domestic employment. We'll try and see this in the Indian context. So domestic shortages get relaxed. If there is no R&D occurring in-house, fine. You have access to R&D intensive inputs from abroad and your production structure takes off. Okay, so but there can be a labor displacing effect of import utilization also, as we just discussed. Okay, so coming back to why is it important to have a structure coherent with the endowments? Because if we don't have it, if we are not working on our labor intensive industries, and if we are concentrated on technology intensive industries where the potential to absorb labor is lesser, then there would be a mass unemployment in the economy. So in order to have equitable growth, sustainable growth, which has a spillover effect till the bottom of the pyramid, we need to have a structure of the economy which is coherent with the factors of production, with our endowment levels. And the point has been emphasized in papers that I've already discussed with you. So if the underlying structure is competent, it is coherent, it will be quick to transform. Because if you have, if you're on some industries which are more dependent on supply chains, and when a supply chain shatters, as we saw in the pandemic, then how will the industry manage? Industry will not be able to cope up. But if some internal integration is there, then the prospects of recovery will be swift and fast, and the cost of relocation would be minimized. So what are these costs of relocation? They can be for agents such as workers, employees, because if a specific industry collapses, then incomes of those workers go down. If incomes go down, then consumption goes down, then demand goes down, and the other sectors of the economy face. And producers also are also a stakeholder, economic stakeholders, because they would like to invest in industries where profits are maximum and markets are assured. So if we are incentivizing specific industries which are not aligned to our endowments, producers are likely to shift their decisions in favor of those industries which are not in sync with endowments, and therefore our domestic endowments will not be utilized. And of course, if the government spending through public spending, so if a larger segment of our endowments, of our workers, are not finding jobs, then the government will have to spend on through subsidizing or through some cash transfers for those segments. So that also adds to government spending, a burden on the government as well. So that's why it is important to be in sync. So the ability to cope up and recover depends on how the economy is positioned when a pandemic like COVID-19 strikes us. So when the COVID pandemic hit, we all know that it was a crisis in the health sector. Our health industry collapsed. There was a shortage of doctors, there was a shortage of beds, there was a shortage of equipment and everything else. But was this only confined to health sector? No, not really. Because when there was a lockdown, people couldn't go to their factories, and so the text. So every other sector came to a standstill. But there were some opportunities for us also. So how were those? So what other sector? How did other sectors collapse? The tourism collapsed because there was no mobility. Manufacturing collapsed because for those industries where physical presence was needed, those industries couldn't operate. But the health sector crisis also, the pandemic also gave us some opportunities. So for instance, our textile sector could shift into making of masks. So we have some very nice cotton based 3-layer masks, etc. The health sector, the chemical sector transformed itself to a mass production of sanitizers, cleaning chemicals, many other things. There were some other needs also. For instance, yes, so we started manufacturing PPE kits. We started manufacturing some other equipment for health, etc. So it had some opportunities also, but not all sectors could cope up. The pandemic was unprecedented, and so were the challenges and opportunities it brought along with it. So the trends in trading also changes. So trade in vaccines, in some cases, it increased for countries like India, which were exporting to hold hands for African countries, whereas some countries also blocked their vaccine exports because they wanted to ensure domestic availability first. But whereas trade in vaccine and some chemicals improved, but the contrary was observed for some non-essential goods. So trade of non-essential goods was essentially blocked because those industries were not operating, and therefore supply chains shattered. We know how many industries, auto industries, tire industries, they were all waiting for their inputs to come because these were non-essential commodities. And this told the world that there is need to look for a China plus model. We need to look beyond China, because when one country is so important in the supply chain and the supply chain shatters and you haven't diversified your sources, then you are far more dependent on that node. So this gave those lessons to all countries in the world. Now, the COVID also gave us technology adoption opportunities, which were through artificial intelligence, digitalization. How? Digitalization. So a lot of consultation with doctors, diagnostics were through digital media. And artificial intelligence also came into picture in radiology, in diagnostics, and in many other areas. So for instance, even in manufacturing. So I'll give you one tiny example. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about something as a firm which is Piramal Glass. So Piramal Glass is a manufacturing unit that makes glass products which are used in perfumes and nail polish bottles, etc. But when COVID came, there was no need for these perfumes and nail polish bottles. And the unit could not operate to manufacture its usual goods because they were non-essential goods, so there was no permission to manufacture. The unit quickly transformed its manufacturing abilities to manufacture what? To manufacture glass products which were used for packaging of food and pharmaceutical. So they were still in the same industry, but they could quickly transform their manufacturing to cater to a different segment of which was an essential good, and the unit got permission for manufacturing. But how could they quickly transform this? Because they had, prior to this, they had some artificial intelligence in their unit. They could integrate this for a facial recognition, because the workers could no more, be checked for their attendance, could no more do that thumb impression at the factory gates. They could operationalize a facial recognition security system. They could operationalize quickly a system where if a worker is not wearing mask, could be detected. If they're violating their social distancing norms in the factory unit, they could be detected, and attention could be given in those violations. So this is how artificial intelligence came into picture, was utilized even in the Indian context, not only in health, but also in manufacturing systems. But how many units could do this? Not many, because we know that a large proportion of our units and our workers are in small and medium sized and micro sized units, which are not as competent as the large manufacturing units have been. I just gave you one example, but you can easily make out not only few could have survived through this kind of an integration of artificial systems. So industries evolved in the response, as I've told you, this industry did, but not all units in a given industry could cope up with this. So what is the point? The point is that there were challenges that were existing in the past, because a lot of those units which had not access to these advanced technologies, nor they can have access to this in immediate future, could not operate, could not come into function, and therefore there were a large number of exits in the micro enterprises. And we know there's no way they have access to these advanced features. So when we have a skewed structure, we need to take into account our positioning when the pandemic hit us. So what was our industry structure on the eve of the pandemic? As I told you, that we entered, so India entered the middle income category of countries by the World Bank definition in about 2008. And we were a low middle income segment, in the low middle income segment. But it's been, so COVID came in 2019. So for about 11 years, we have stayed at the bottom of the middle income segment. So having entered the middle income segment, we haven't upgraded, we haven't been able to upgrade our economy. So we are stuck in what is being referred as the middle income trap. So if we aspire to move up, then we have to have a policy which is more sustainable, which raises concerns on the policy approach that we have adopted in all these years. Now, to have optimal growth, if the underlying industrial upgrading, and the industrial upgrading occurred where? It occurred more in a capital intensive segment relative to the labor intensive segments. The labor intensive textiles, leathers have also upgraded. This is not to deny. But the focus, the benefits, and the realization of upgradations has been more in a capital intensive segment. As you can see, we talked about how the Piramal glass manufacturing unit, how the Siemens is also another example. They coped up very well with the pandemic. So where the comparative advantage due to our rich labor endowments have been lying, the upgradation has not been as fast in those industries. And that's why we need to review everything now. We should begin to rethink. So in my recent paper, I've talked about this point where I'm saying the relative use of capital has gone up. Even it has gone up for all sectors of the economy, whether they're capital intensive or labor intensive. Everywhere the relative use of capital has gone up. And therefore, our labor endowments, our workers also need to gear up to be suitable, to be adaptive to a more capital intensive environment. And this has structural implications which affects our job opportunities, because not everybody, not every farmer who's moving out from agriculture sector is so where are these? So okay, let me talk about the recent labor force data. And this article came up yesterday, which talks that the recent labor force data shows that there are some encouraging news on labor force. But if you dig down deeper, the labor force is actually increasing back. So there's a retrogression. They're going back into agriculture, and the increase, and it's contracting in services, it's contracting in manufacturing. Now, this is not a good news, because the manufacturing jobs are where the productivity lies, where the income gains would be there. And for a long while, and the development path also occurs from primary to manufacturing to tertiary. So our people are going back. So this is the latest periodic labor force data which is showing, and which is not a very pleasant news. Now, why are people going back to farms? Because they could not be absorbed into manufacturing, which is now moving towards artificial intelligence and better upgradation. They are not adaptive, they are not trained, they are not skilled to be fit in those industries, one. And two, those industries also need to be operating at a larger scale so that more and more of people find jobs. Now, initially, earlier, when people move out of their agriculture occupations, they were more going into tertiary sector services. Now, what for those kind of jobs? Those service jobs are, not everybody is a IT professional from a farm. Not everybody can be trained into an IT professional. So a lot of those people find jobs in service sector, in hospitality, as cleaners, as servers in hotels, restaurants, as gardeners, as drivers, etc. Now imagine how much can they make out of their livings? Are these jobs secure? Are these jobs going to give them incremental incomes? No. But if we can have a structure where a lot of these workers who are displaced, dislocated, relocating from agriculture find their jobs in manufacturing, it would be a very good benefit for all of them. So because manufacturing is where the productive jobs lie, where there is a scope to have better security for jobs. So we need to understand that and our manufacturing system was not able to do this in the pandemic. And also this was not happening even prior to the pandemic, because just on the eve of pandemic for the last 1 year in 2018, we were seeing that economy is slowing down, unemployment is increasing, jobs are being lost. And why was this happening? This was essentially happening because our manufacturing was not able to absorb all the people which were coming out from either agriculture. We were not. So that is where I'm stressing that we need to look back. We need to see where we are positioned before we decide how are we going to recover, what is going to be our recovery strategy. So we need to identify those bottlenecks and conclude with suggestions for an economic structure which is more compatible in terms of its resources and sectors. So, as I told you, are these concerns of employment incidental or are they structural? Incidental means do they just come up because pandemic came up? Are they suddenly on us? The concerns of unemployment, concerns of incomes not rising, concerns of jobs not increasing, or are these structural in nature? As I've discussed with you at length, these are not incidental. The pandemic has not brought, the pandemic aggravated them. But these concerns, these problems are structural in nature. because they were with us even prior to the pandemic. Right. So, and why are these things happening? Why have our capital intensive industries, like we are now exporters of electronics and machinery, but we are losing our textile exports to countries like Bangladesh. So our electronics, given our endowments of labor intense of cheap labor, our textiles haven't taken off, but our electronics, our machinery, our non-electrical machinery, we are doing better than what we were doing in 90s in these segments. So why so? Why are we going against our endowments? Because because when capital intake from imported capital goods improved, it helped the capital intensive manufacturing, and there was nothing explicit done for our labor intensive manufacturing. So as capital in the domestic economy, capital intensity increased, the access to capital became cheaper, the relative cost of capital to wage reduced, and the producers make their decision based on relative cost. So if it is easy to access capital and difficult to engage labor, also because of the labor regulations, people will the business will not engage in labor intensive activities. They would rather choose either capital intensive activities or capital intensive technology for labor intensive activities. So the relative use of factors, what are the two factors we are talking? We are talking of labor and capital, have transformed, if not completely relocated, but definitely transformed in favor of capital, which has contributed to our changing structure of production. And we are graduating towards a more capital intensive production structure, whereas our underlying endowments are still labor. We have a mass of unskilled labor with us. So what actually, and so as I told you, that the trade pattern amounts to domestic leakages. So domestic leakages means since we got easy access to capital goods, we started importing them. Now, if we have easier access to technology and more quality and sophisticated goods, the domestic, and there was no emphasis on indigenous R&D activity, so the domestic R&D did not take off. Now, to give you an example, to give you some figures, our R&D investment, our R&D as a percentage of GDP is 0.3, vis-a-vis the global average of 1.5. So if we have to reach global standards, we have to scale up by a factor of 5, which is huge to achieve, because R&D initiatives need dedicated long-term policy in place. It is not a stopgap arrangement. It has to be done in a very thoughtful and a planned manner. So since we did not have indigenous policies to encourage indigenous R&D, technology was accessed through imports. Now, if technology is accessed through imports, but the system of education in the economy is not preparing its students, its younger demographic participants to be adapted to that technology, those people stay unskilled and will not find jobs in these more advanced production units also. So we need to undertake research in terms of what are the employment impacts of our trading pattern, and need to essentially answer, has our emerging trade pattern affected the use of labor and capital in the economy? And let's see, and I'll show you the results. So I did this research, which is published very recently in this year. And what I'm trying to show you here, so this is done at a much more disaggregated level. What I'm trying to show you here is only for 3 broad sectors: agriculture, 4 broad sectors: mining, manufacturing, and services. So if you look at the overall economy, which is all, you will see that in the latest year, there is a negative effect of import utilization. So when we consume imported inputs, which have both capital embodied into them and also labor, because when they are manufactured there is some manpower going into that. That manpower could be skilled and could be less skilled, but there is a use of labor and there is a use of capital intensity, means there's a use of technology there also. So that use of imported inputs in the economy is contributing to so its effect is 9%. So the effect of import utilization on employment requirement, the use of employment, the use of manpower, persons engaged in 1 unit of producing 1 unit of output goes down by 9%, which is huge. And just in 1993, which was the year when we were liberalizing, so even then, this effect of import utilization was minus 7%. So there was a displacement of employment. And you see, this has aggravated to 9%. So that means it's not only technology imports that we are, it's not only capital, domestic capital, which is not taking off. We are also losing jobs. Some jobs are being lost. And if you see down this, you will see that this negative effect is strongest, highest in the manufacturing. It is high. So mining is highest, but so why is mining highest? Because our mining inputs are coal that we use for non-coking coal, which we use for electricity generation. And coal is a mining input, which is labor intensive. But the share of mining inputs is relatively less. So if you give weight to the inputs, then manufacturing, between agriculture, manufacturing and services, 18% is the employment effect of import utilization, which is huge. And as you will see, that this is only magnified over the period of time. So that this shows relatively, if you compare services and agriculture and manufacturing, you can make out that we are losing a lot of jobs in our manufacturing segment, relatively more to other segments. And manufacturing is the segment where there lies a potential to absorb a mass of unskilled labor, and we are losing it. Okay. So that's why, so what comes out? That there is an incoherency. We are out of sync between our structure of production, because our production is dependent on imports, and imports are causing this much of damage, but underlies a lot of mass workforce which is not engaged because we are importing. So this is not to say that we should not import. We should import, because these imports, if they are of critical nature, if they are of some raw materials where there is no domestic substitute. For instance, in API, the advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, the active pharmaceutical ingredients in the pharma industry, till time we don't have a sufficient domestic availability. And if we stop imports of APIs, our pharma industry, which is a sunrise industry, we have outshined in the world in this pandemic, and even prior to the pandemic, our pharma would collapse. So we need to import strategic imports, but we should develop our domestic competencies for that. Let's move on to next. So I've discussed these points with you earlier, so I'll not read them again for you. Let's talk about, so we talk about the employment effect. Now we are talking of the labor income effect. All right. So as you see that employment is going down, because much of our labor is of unskilled nature. So this change that you see here is also showing you the same trend. It's showing you a negative effect of import utilization on labor income, on the component of income attributed to labor in the total value of output. So in total value of output, there is a value addition component, there is an intermediate use component, and there are some taxes. So in that value addition component, we have some labor income and we have some capital income. So as you can see, that labor income goes down, and it goes down most significantly in manufacturing, because we could have picked up those jobs if our manufacturing system would have been strengthened for indigenous production. So I've discussed this with you. So similarly on capital income, I'll show you the results. So on capital income again, so the capital income effect of import utilization is again highest in manufacturing. It's negative throughout, but it's highest for for manufacturing. What I'm trying to highlight here is that what does it mean? Capital income is going down. So it's a proxy. It's a fair proxy, not an exact indicator of R&D, but it's fairly a fair proxy. So instead of indulging in domestic R&D, because there's policy uncertainty and also there is no focus to drive in indigenous domestic R&D for a on a long-term basis. When imports are cheaper, the units, whenever they have to upgrade their technology, for instance, of the factories that I discussed earlier in the presentation, these things can be imported. So when they are imported, our capital intensity increases. Look at this. Our capital intensity increases. So our capital intensity increases, but it increases without an indigenous activity. And this is where I'm trying to show the relative use of factors. So this is K to L ratio, labor income, capital income to labor income. So if you see for the overall economy, it has increased. So in the overall economy, we are more capital using now. In agriculture also, so this is 0.87 and this is 0.91. That's why you are seeing them to be same, but they're different at 2-digit level. So for mining also, for manufacturing also, and for services. So whichever broad sector you pick up, there is a relatively more use of capital. That means we are turning a more capital intensive economy. But our endowments, our factors of production, we are immensely endowed with labor. So the underlying point is try to make you realize that we are out of sync because we haven't developed our domestic manufacturing industry. And only realizing this, the government has launched the PLI, the Performance Linked Incentive Scheme, where mass production is being encouraged so that even if it is in electronics, smartphone manufacturing, or some other units, when these units expand on a mass scale, more people will get jobs. So we're trying to, strengthen our manufacturing base through these policies, which have been recently launched in the pandemic. So you see the pandemic, the policy making in the pandemic began to see these things, but when it occurred, but only after the effect was so bad. So I must discuss this. So this is what we observed from those charts was that that two separate measurements of labor intensity, that means labor income use and capital income, can be confined to one common index, one common measure of relative use of capital, which is K to L ratio. And at the aggregate level, we saw that the relative capital use has increased. And if this relative capital income has increased by 9.4% from 1993 to 2015. So this translates to a per annum increment of increase in relative use of capital by 0.45%. So now you see that if we want to, indigenously use capital goods, then the domestic production of capital goods has to be at a rate greater than 0.45. Okay, because this is the rate at which our relative use of capital is increasing. If we want to indigenize this change, our domestic production of capital goods through import substitution or through strategic interventions has to yield has to yield a production which is at a rate faster than 0.45. But from some reports, we know that our capital goods sector has expanded only at 0.4%, that per annum, which shows that there is a deficit. Now, if there is a deficit, then that deficit will be met from imports. So if we are importing, we continue to be dependent on imports. That's just one part of the story. But if we are importing, then we do not know what technology are we using. If we do not know what technology are we using, we have not trained our people to be adaptive to that technology. And if our people are not, all of our people are adaptive, they will not find jobs in those plants where this technology is being adapted. Only few will be finding their jobs. So the summary of findings of those 3 or 4 tables and charts is that we have increased our intensity of capital use, but this has been due to domestic shortages. And we have defined our comparative advantage in labor. Our dependency on capital has increased. It has increased even for labor. As we saw in the labor income chart, the effect was negative, and it was more negative in 2015 than it was in 1993. But the effect has been much more strong for capital inputs than for labor inputs. So the industrial structure is expected to align with factor-intensive sectors and increasing. So whatever factor is easily available, the producer will change its manufacturing decision in that favor. If capital is readily available, they will indulge into capital intensive production structure. And that's why they are doing it, because capital is easily available and the wage ratios are going up, and the capital K-to-L ratio, the rental values are going down because capital is now easily available. So the structure of production is changing to capital intensity, but the labor force is largely unskilled. So there is no sync there, or the sync is weak, the connect is weak. And we saw, I haven't shown you detailed sector-wise results, but the employment displacement, that negative thing, was noted even for labor-intensive sectors, even in textiles, apparel. Also, we are facing a displacement effect. So the relatively stronger impact of imported inputs on labor income is further indicated that a larger proportion of labor income is embedded in imported goods. So we are importing textiles also. So the puzzle that why is India, being a labor endowed country, turning into having a structure of production which is more capital intensive? It's because of our pattern. It's because our integration pattern where capital inputs are contributing to this change. So what are the implications? The implications of this are that a lower domestic investment is lower. It continues to be lower. As we saw, the 0.45 and the 0.4% shows that there is a deficit. Greater invest, and therefore we continue to have dependence on imported capitals. And this leads to a widening in the demand and supply of skills. I told you, if we do not know what artificial intelligence technology, what kind of manpower skills it would need, some at least, will it need, our people will not find jobs there. Only few will find. Either we will adapt that technology in our units, and or we will train only few workforce. So those industries will not be achieving scale production, and scale is the key to employment generation. And that's why the performance linked incentive in policy of the government is focusing on large scale manufacturing, because more and more people will get jobs there. The use of capital imports, which also embody technology and innovation of a very high order, advanced technology, it prevents the domestic industry from anticipating the spectrum of skills which will we needed to operationalize that machinery which they are importing. And therefore, there's a mismatch in technology and the skill set which is available. So these implications, this has implications on lesser jobs and therefore lesser labor incomes. Few which will manage to get skilled will find jobs. Their incomes because of their skills might be better, but a large mass will continue to have lower incomes or no incomes. In the absence of indigenous R&D activity, the continued dependency on imported capital inputs will have a constraining effect on workers' access to technology. If this technology was developed in-house, that transmission from the R&D unit to the industry and from the industry to the education system, which prepares its curriculum for education programs, for vocational training, for technical trainings, would work in a more integrated manner. And so domestically abundant endowments of labor will need to be more compliant, more adaptive to these technological changes. So what are the implications? In view of the generally increasing use of capital, which is expected to further increase, this change is irreversible. There will not be a U-turn now. We will only move forward and not backward. Therefore, the way to move forward is to bring up your labor to match that scale, or to expand the scale of those units which are using this advanced technology, so that it becomes necessary to anticipate the implications on labor, the employment implications in terms of their compatibility and adaptability with a more capital intensive manufacturing setup in the industry. With fast changing technological norms such as the artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things, the reversal from to going to a less capital intensive setup is not going to be possible, is not a possibility to explore. So it's a catch-22 situation. It's a paradox where the production technique will become more technology intensive, but the labor has also to be brought into that system. So we cannot go back, but our labor has to be brought forward into that. Thus it becomes prudent to devise future policy to simultaneously correct for an import dependency of capital goods and the demand supply mismatch which is in the labor market. Just give me a second, please. There's a call. Hello. Can I take your call later? I'm in a meeting. Hello. Yes, I'm sorry. So the way forward is that the labor market has to be more adequate, has to be more skilled, has to be more skilled. So for this, we need to design a business model for the entrepreneurs so that they will be encouraged for on-job trainings for their employees. So if instead of firing, if instead of throwing out workers whenever they adopt a new technology, if the entrepreneurs are subsidized through trainings, this could possibly be something that can be explored. We need to pay attention to strengthen the ability of the overall system of education to be able to rightly anticipate what is going to be the demand for skills in future. Because if we know the future technologies, we can prepare our people by training them. And engaging the domestic industry for indigenous in-house R&D is very important, because when we are doing it ourselves, we know what kind of manpower we will need to employ this kind of a technology. So that communication from R&D, whether it's in public sector or private sector, to the industry which is going to make use of that technology, to the skill centers, will be very important and useful. We need to emphasize the use of domestically produced capital goods for a stronger ecosystem. The two mechanisms which are of domestic production of capital intensive sectors and their connection, their feedback into the labor market will be very important in development of a training curriculum that is more demand driven as compared to a skill program which is more supply driven. So instead of teaching what we just have to teach, we will be able to upgrade our curriculum to what is going to be needed by the industry. And with that, I bring my presentation to close. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time as well as for your comprehensive and analytical interpretation as to how labor and capital work in Indian economy, as well as how it is imperative that we invest more in indigenous R&D to limit our dependency on import substitution. I believe we have a few questions asked on the chat box, so let me just recite them for you, ma'am. This question is from Sanchit Gupta. India's trade deficit rose by 88% in 2021-22. Rupees nearing 80 to $1. The government also highlighted the twin deficit issue recently and has started taking measures to counter it, like hiking the import duty on gold. What are your thoughts on this?
So, as I told you, that the solution is not to raise the barrier, is not to stop import, but the solution to reducing the trade deficit is to develop in-house capacities to substitute for the imports. And how will that happen? That will happen if we correct our policy approach, if we correct for these incoherencies that we have discussed. So we continue to, that trade deficit widened for a lot of reasons. Maybe it widened because a lot of inputs were needed, and which were also for capital intensive nature and also not so capital intensive nature, and also a large part of our imports are on gold. So gold is something which is not essential, and that's why the government has recently, in just last week, they have hiked their import duty. But remember, when you hike your duty, then you also encourage a lot of gray channel trading of gold. Now, when gray channel trading of gold occurs, it has its different implications. So gold which cannot be tracked can easily be adulterated. Now, if it is adulterated, then you're losing a brand value in the international market, because international market is very sensitive to quality consciousness. So this is on regard of gold. But because gold is non-essential, so it can be blocked for a short while. And imports of gold we are dependent on imports of gold because of the raw material kind of thing. So this is where we cannot probably substitute for imports. But there are many other things where we can substitute for imports. And that is where lies our ability to enhance our manufacturing capabilities in manufacturing, where we can, so for instance, you'll see that the deficit would have declined in terms of imports of mobile phones because we have a PLI taking off now. We have something in terms of advanced textiles taking off now, which are used in different, even in tourism, advanced textiles are used. So we are trying to contain that, but it takes time. And when it takes time, we should be able to anticipate well in advance where we want to go. So you might like to read the next question, Shirish?
Yes, ma'am. Another question, this one from Manav Negi. Is the change in consumer preference due to COVID having a good effect or a bad effect on GDP? Also, what can we expect for economic growth in the near future?
So what was the first question? Is the
change in consumer preference due to COVID having a good or bad effect on GDP?
All right. Okay. So see, there are two ways to talk about anything. You can talk about GDP, macro level, and then you can talk. So whenever there's a change at a macro level, there are losers and gainers. Somebody gains and somebody loses. So when you look within the macro level, at a micro level, there are gainers and losers. So for instance, what do you talk? You talk about change in consumer patterns, consumer preferences. So what consumer preferences changed? So immediately what I can relate to your question is consumer preferences change for packaged food which is hygienically packaged and delivered to your door. So the packaged industry picked up. So these consumer preferences are incentivizing a food processing industry. And that industry in turn incentivizes the packaging industry because they need machinery for for packaging of food. They need paper cardboard for packaging of food. So this in turn impacts the paper cardboard making industry. So with this preference, a lot of industries take off. But when consumer preferences changes to packaged food, the street side vendor loses his job because he cannot stand, because there's a social distancing norm. He cannot come out because you're not going to buy from him. So he loses his income. Now, if the amount of such income lost exceeds the amount of income gained in the food processing industry, at a macro level, there would be a positive or a negative gain. But if you talk in terms of the head count, if this food processing industry expands and engages, say, X number of people more, and those street side vendors are 10 times X who lose their jobs, then in terms of head count, and if these 10 times X people had they found their jobs in the food processing industry, the relocation would not have been as painful. So in terms of income, you can make out, but in terms of the segments that lose and gain income, those things have to be weighed and measured accordingly. So things have to be taken into account. So next question.
Yes, ma'am. The next question is by Tejin Solanki. In India, the rate of interest on export finance is much higher than that compared to other countries. According to trade circles, interest payments alone constitute 15% of the cost of production in India. In addition, there is also the bank charges in India, which work out to be as high as 3% compared to the 1% rates prevailing in countries like Japan and the Republic of Korea. Even the redemption under broad debt scheme has decreased. So what can we say about other ways by which we can win this economic war with other countries?
So you have actually given an answer in your own question. So why are we uncompetitive? Because we are exporting a lot of interest payments along with our goods, so which increases our cost. So the efficiency will. So one part of it is that we need to have our exports financed at more competitive rates, and that export financing so that we are competitive with other countries. And the other part is that even other than these export financing conditions, we have a lot of logistics issues. We have a lot of waiting time on our ports, and so those logistics things are also need to be streamlined, and collectively then we can meet international standards, and we are aggressively working towards that. Do you have any more questions?
Yes, ma'am. The final question, final and fourth question we have is from Sanchit. Since you just mentioned the importance of labor-intensive industries for India, India used to be the second largest manufacturer of textiles, but due to disruptions in the local supply chain, we have since fallen to 5th position in the last few years. What can the government do to regain that position?
Yeah, so this is this is the most burning question, because we just say that what to do. How will our textiles take off? How will our textiles take off? So one way is why has Bangladesh taken off? They concentrated, so a major chunk of their economy is driven by the textile sector, and the success is also in terms of gender, because the Bangladesh textile industry has a fair amount of female participation, so which increases the benefit to many more households. So how do we incentivize our textiles manufacturing? So a part of the answer in Bangladesh's success is also they have a beneficial low tariff or no tariff access to developers because of their low developing country status, least LDC status, which we do not have. So we face some tariffs. Now in order to market our output competitively to our rivals in the neighborhood, the answer lies in improving our competitiveness. Now, how do we improve our competitiveness? The answer lies in large scale manufacturing, mass scale manufacturing. And therefore, if we can, so initially, but why? But there has been a perpetual runaway tendency of the Indian businessmen from labor-intensive industries. Why? Because they have a view that it's difficult to handle labor, etc., etc. So with the new labor norms that have come into place from the 1st of July, are a move in that direction. But what the government can also do is to maybe have one or two what do we call it? Some ideals to follow. So maybe by invitation, if the government invites, maybe identifies some major and requests them to indulge into a textile activity. And if they are successfully and sees to it, they provide them everything that they need to be successful, it would have a strong demonstration effect. And this is the point which Dr. Naushad Forbes has also made in one of his webinars, that the demonstration effect can change the mindsets of Indian businessmen. And more people will then start turning their heads to Indian textiles. And we can do some better designing of our cotton fabrics, because we have an advantage in cotton. So we should be able to, maybe doing this can help our Indian textiles.
And I believe that will be all, ma'am. All right, then in that case, I shall now proceed with the vote of thanks. Yes. As with all good things, so much this session be brought to a halt. But in our parting, I must now thank our speaker, Dr. Anjali Tondon, for giving us her precious time, as well as sharing her valued insights into various economic matters. My heartfelt gratitude to our professor, to our principal, Professor Gyantyos Kumar Jha, who has always been there to cheer us on and act as a support system for our endeavors. Moreover, I'm ever more thankful to our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Vinita Thuli, for promoting learning sessions in our college and for giving us this platform. The society is greatly indebted to our member teachers from FIC, Dr. Apara Naidu and Mr. Uttam Kumar, and to our teacher in charge of the Department of Economics, Rajan Sarnakar, as well as to Mr. Ravinder Pant, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, for the technical assistance. Moreover, thank you to Dr. Balkrishnan Negi for the formal introduction and for hosting a wonderful session. And furthermore, my thanks goes to each and every one of our core members at FIC, Avi, Priyanshu, Pratham, Sukriti, Rabha, Divya, Shweta, Arga, Deep, Swati, Akshit, Shashank, and Priyanshu for all their tireless efforts. But most importantly, we thank you, the audience, who has been keenly glued in for the last hour and a half, and I certainly hope this has been an eye-opening session for you all. Thanking you all for joining in, and we look forward to hosting you once more on 8th July, 11 p.m. Good day and good health to you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anjali. Thank you so much for the last moment rush which was created. And there were many participants, but they were waiting, and then at the end, many left. So we had around 140, and then we were expecting more good strength. But thank you so much for the last one. Yeah.
Pleasure. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.